Killing Floor 2 has been out in early access for a while now, so I'm gonna make a video about it. I've put over 80 hours into it since it was released less than a month ago, and a good chunk of that was on Suicidal and Hell on Earth. I know there are several players who've played more than that, but I think it's enough to at least make it possible that I know what I'm talking about. Before I start, I want to mention that while I'm going to focus mostly on the negatives in this video, I like the game a lot so far. I'll start off with what I consider to be a minor balance issue, which is that the M4 is considered to be quite a bad weapon by almost all players. For starters, the M4 holds 2 fewer shells than the SG-500 pump shotgun that the support spawns with. At first I thought this may be a concession for realism, but then I realized the gun's real-life counterpart actually holds 1 more shell. The low number of shots means that, even with the increased fire rate, the M4 is only really helpful against small groups of low to mid-tier enemies, which can already be effectively dealt with by the pump. And because the pump is what you spawn with, it essentially costs 0 dodge, while the M4 costs 1100, only 400 less than the AA-12. Since the support's main goal is usually to save up enough dodge to get an AA-12 as quickly as possible, such an investment for a gun that's only slightly better than the starting shotgun is not worth it. Even for an in-game loadout, the M4 doesn't look too appealing since it weighs too much to be used along with the AA-12 unless a certain perk bonus is taken. I don't consider that too big of an issue. I just don't use the M4 and still have fun with the other guns, but of course it would be better if the gun were balanced. I think lowering the M4's cost to 650, the same as a hunting shotgun's, would be a good solution. Such a drastic decrease in cost may seem like overkill to some, but even at that price, I think I'd often still choose the hunting shotgun. And that's not even taking into account the fact that you can hold the AA-12, hunting shotgun, and medic pistol, all without taking the perk bonus. The music in this game is great, and there's even an option to enable the vocals for the tracks. When thinking about game design before, I actually thought of that idea, and I thought I was kind of a genius for it. So I thought it was pretty cool when I saw it in Killing Floor 2. But there's one problem when it comes to enjoying the game's music. I appreciate the indication that a Scrake or Flesh Pound has spawned, but it's pretty jarring for the music to fade out to being almost muted. In later waves, multiple Scrakes and Flesh Pounds spawn, meaning the music is going to be interrupted that way again and again. I really don't think the audio cues would be any less effective if the music would just continue playing over them. Although the audio cue for Flesh Pound spawning is quite loud, Flesh Pounds themselves are a bit too quiet if you ask me. If you're not up close, and have just a few more Zeds in the area to provide their own sounds, you're not likely to even hear a Flesh Pound when it's raging. Listen to this Flesh Pound from KF1. And compare that to this one in KF2. Something I noticed immediately about Killing Floor 2 is that it's much easier to hit teammates with medic darts due to the medic weapons locking onto teammates, causing their darts to home in on them. Unfortunately, the healing syringe that everybody starts with has had the opposite treatment. It almost seems impossible to heal teammates with it. I'm not even certain what's causing it, as often I'll be right up against a wounded teammate spamming click and the syringe absolutely will not heal them. It's something that's kinda hard to test, so I honestly don't know what the ultimate cause of the problem is, but I get the feeling that increasing its range just a little bit would help. Before I move on to more major issues, I'm gonna list a few things quickly that don't merit much explanation. There's no indication in the HUD for carry weight. The voice commands lack a few particularly useful choices that were in Killing Floor 1, like, let's hole up here, thanks, sorry, and insult players. Medics get a very low amount of XP for healing, compared to killing. There's no vokick option, meaning if somebody goes AFK in a public server, they're a burden on the remainder of the game. If you rebind alt-fire to something other than default, you're unable to switch spectator modes without console commands. When the player has blood on their knife, and the reload key is hit, they'll wipe the blood on their sleeve. But this makes no sense for Anna because she just is like rubbing the knife on her spikes. I mean, at the very least, it should make a scraping sound. Alright, I'd like to move on to some more major issues, specifically regarding Hans. Overall, I like Hans' design. He has like a cool personality, and I like the idea behind his fight. But there are some pretty big issues with it currently. First off, his grenades can be pretty difficult to see, especially his explosive grenades, which glow red. I think glowing red is a pretty bad choice when the environment is often covered in blood. Considering that his grenades can kill you in seconds, and you're going to be fighting him at the end of the game, possibly after half an hour or more of build-up, I think there should be no ambiguity as to where he throws his grenades. On the subject of visibility, Hans' telegraph for using his guns just consists of him grabbing them and pointing them at the player. The problem is that it's pretty hard to see that at a distance. The player only has about a second to react, and they do a ton of damage, so again, it should be clear when he's about to start shooting. As it is, when I'm fighting Hans, I'll peek out of cover, fire a few shots, and go back in cover, even if I don't think he's about to start shooting, just to be safe. That serves to make the fight feel kinda tedious. I think one good solution offered by Tripwire forum member Cherry Bassa is to put laser sights on Hans' guns. As a poster in that thread points out, Hans has specific lines of dialogue to indicate when he's pulling his guns out. That's a good point, but I don't think it's a good enough indication. Like I said, the player has a very short time to react, and often Hans can start shooting right as his dialogue starts, before the player has a chance to even hear which line he's saying. There's an aspect of Hans' damage resistance period that I think everyone can agree should change, and that's the complete lack of conveyance to the player that he's even resisting damage. When I first started playing the game, every time Hans started to grab a player and heal, I and the rest of my team would spend a full mag or more of ammo laying into him. I didn't find out until later on that he has very high damage resistance when he is healing, and I only found out from word of mouth, not from any kind of experience from the game. There really ought to be some kind of indication in the game that he takes far less damage during the hunt and healing phase. I've seen a player mention some kind of force field appearing around him once the resistance starts, and that seems like an effective solution to me, and it probably wouldn't take much work for Tripwire to add. One last thing I want to mention about Hans is that currently the best strategy is to just mass AA-12s against Hans. I suspect an ideal team for beating him would be 6 supports with AA-12s and medic pistols. I'm not too worried about this because Demo and Sharpshooter haven't been added to the game yet, among all the other perks that also haven't been added, and once they're put in, I have a feeling there will be more dominant strategies, but in the meantime, fighting Hans is kinda boring. In Killing Floor 1, 2 or more grenades thrown within range of each other would detonate each other. That was a useful way of delivering a huge amount of damage all at once, and it was particularly effective against flesh pounds. It was also just a really cool, kind of realistic effect that I still have never seen in any other first-person shooter. But it's absent from Killing Floor 2. Like I said, it's a minor detail, but it's only a minor detail because there's no demo perk yet. Once the Demolitions perk is released, I think it'll be very important for that feature to be re-added, as it's an effect that synergized very well with the Demolitions grenade launchers. I suspect that Tripwire already intends to put this functionality back in, but it's worth mentioning. Also, this is pure speculation, but it could also be the case that only Demolitions will be able to do that. While that would be kind of unrealistic, I think it would be a good idea from a game design perspective. It would emphasize the demo's specialty with explosives over other perks, and it would also achieve Tripwire's stated goal of giving each perk their own unique type of grenades. Before the game's release, Tripwire talked about how they wanted to encourage teams to move around the map, changing holdout areas as the waves progressed. One way to encourage that is to give the maps destructible lighting. When there's so little light in an area that you can barely see, it's better to move to a different area, right? Problem is, there are a lot of lights that are completely indestructible. Biotics Lab is the worst offender here. Here's a quick walkthrough of the map after I've destroyed every light possible. and I'm going to show a comparison of some of these rooms with the lights still intact. You can clearly see there's a difference. The rooms are definitely darker once the lights are out, but because of the remaining indestructible lights, the rooms are still light enough that players aren't any less inclined to stay in those rooms. And this is true for every room in Biotics Lab. It's a good idea for there to be some rooms that are always lit. It would be pretty stupid for people to end up on Wave 10 and always need their flashlights on no matter where they went. Furthermore, it could be that Tripwire just didn't intend for every map to be affected this way by lighting, and Biotics is just one of those maps that they wanted to always be lit. But Biotics Lab could have implemented lighting in a more believable way. Let me compare it to a map that handles it much better in my opinion, Burning Paris. One of the better places to hold out in Burning Paris is in the subway, but the subway is already pretty dark as soon as the map starts, and its few lights are destructible, potentially leaving players almost completely in the dark. On street level though, there's plenty of non-destructible lighting in the form of the moonlight. Biotics could have handled it in a similar way. In some of these rooms you can see outside to the rocky mountain landscape. Simply placing some form of lighting out here, shining in through the bulletproof glass, would serve as believable lighting that couldn't be destroyed. In this large room, placing more light sources behind this bulletproof glass would work pretty well. Unfortunately, even Burning Paris doesn't seem to get the lighting mechanic totally right. One of the more popular holdout areas is this hallway in the hotel. The windows in this hallway let moonlight in, so it being somewhat lit is believable. But considering how good the layout for this hallway is, it doesn't seem appropriate that it should also have decent lighting. What's more, it still has inexplicably indestructible lights, so even from an immersion perspective, it still gets it wrong. Don't get me wrong, I don't think world believability or immersion are very important in a game like Killing Floor. That's just a minor point, but the effects the lighting has on the flow of the game are very important. On the topic of encouraging players to move from one holdout area to another common complaint, which I agree with, is that welding doors is far less useful, to the point where people almost never do it anymore. One of the main reasons of this is that in Killing Floor 2, when a door takes a certain amount of damage, it gets destroyed, and stays that way for the rest of the game. This serves to make welded doors more like a limited resource that the player must choose the correct time to use. It's stupid to weld a door in the early game, but makes sense when you want to buy the team some extra time against an incoming Scrake or a Fleshpound, or just a large group of trash later on in the game. And I like that idea in theory, it adds an element of strategy. The problem is that unwelded doors can already be used quite effectively. If players are being pressured by a fast-moving group of trash, or again a raging Scrake or a Fleshpound, closing a door behind them as they run away can be an effective way of buying a few seconds as they escape. Zeds have to take a couple seconds to stop and open the door, whereas players don't have to slow down at all to close the door behind them. While it may not buy as much time as welding a door to 100%, it can also be done much faster and thus on much shorter notice than welding. And more to the point, it can be done an infinite number of times. If a door is destroyed, even just closing it becomes impossible, so as it currently stands, players aren't incentivized to weld a door to begin with. One change that I think could help the situation is making it so that when a door is broken, it can still be closed normally, just not welded anymore. I admit that's not a particularly graceful solution, both because it's incompatible with the logic of a door breaking, but also because it would do nothing to further incentivize players to move around the map. In Killing Floor 1, Zeds could teleport in out of thin air when they spawned, as long as it was out of the player's line of sight. In Killing Floor 2, Zeds can do that anytime, even after they've spawned. Zeds who you thought were behind you, following you, can end up in front of you around the next corner, perhaps blocking you in a tight corridor. I'm hesitant to say that Zeds teleporting itself is a problem, but the way it's currently implemented definitely is. This clip is probably the most popular example to the community of the ridiculousness that can happen, and this clip of what happened to me the other day should show exactly why it can be a big problem. The exact strategy for dealing with an enraged Fleshpound, at least when soloing, is to have distance from it. When the Fleshpound can teleport directly next to you in the middle of its enraged state, there's a pretty big problem. As this raging Fleshpound demonstrates, Zeds teleporting a lot takes away from the skill of situational awareness a player can have about which Zeds are where. A while back I noticed that teleporting Zeds was a bigger problem in general when soloing. At first I figured it was just because more players taking care of enemies at once made it harder to notice or to be affected by, but then I found this Reddit post which has a lot of info about Zed teleportation. I'd like to put emphasis on the poster's line of, "Don't consider all information here as a fact." What I'm about to say is assuming that this info is accurate, but I want people to keep in mind that I didn't do this kind of testing myself, so this could be wrong. Anyway, one of the details mentioned in this post is that Zeds can check for the possibility to teleport every 5 seconds, and they can teleport within 12 meters of a player. It also essentially mentions that Zeds won't teleport as long as the player keeps looking in their direction, even if it's through a wall. The game uses line of sight or relevant to refer to what I believe is the criteria determining whether a Zed will teleport or not. After seeing this Reddit post, I did some soloing on Hell on Earth. I just ran away from enemies while looking at them. I made it a point to spin around a lot, like not just looking at the group of Zeds chasing me every couple seconds, but I did a full 360 to look in the direction of pretty much everything. I found that enemies appeared in front of me way less than usual. It still happened, but not nearly as much, and most of the time I think it was from a Zed actually dying, and thus a new one spawning. The point is that, at least to an extent, Zed teleportation is something that the player can influence. The question is, should that be a skill the players need to exercise for optimal play? Spinning around a lot? I don't really know what to think about the issue. I mean, I can see why Zed teleportation was put in. There are some good things about it. It prevents Zeds from getting stuck. It does add difficulty. Having every single spawn Zed safely behind you because you kited them properly and picking them off one at a time for the rest of the wave is kinda easy, and it can get kinda boring. And it's not nearly as intense as KF2, where you're always worried about dealing with what might be around the next corner. So I don't know what should be done. But I am confident that a raged Scrake or Flesh Pound should not be able to teleport. A lot of players seem to think that Scrakes are too tanky. I understand why they'd think that. So far, in all the 6-man games I've played on Hell on Earth or even Suicidal, the team is heavily reliant on supports with AA-12s to take on the Scrakes. In this game, the whole team had been wiped, except for myself, a support, and a commando. We went from one intense engagement with remaining Scrakes to the next, scrounging for more ammo for my AA-12 in between each one, and this was just on Suicidal. KF player Out of Real Man put it well when he described it as the team being doomed when the heavy hitter, the AA-12 support, is dead. If there are only 5 Zeds left, a player shouldn't be incapable of finishing the wave just because one of them is a Scrake and they don't have an AA-12. But I'm just saying I understand the concern. That doesn't mean I agree with it. Many have made the counter-argument that, so far, Sharpshooter and Demolitions are absent from the game, 2 perks that particularly excelled in taking on Scrakes and Flesh Pounds in Killing Floor 1. I've then often seen the counter argument that the teams should not be so reliant on those particular perks to kill Scrakes, and I agree. That wouldn't really be any different from the current situation with the support perk. But an argument I haven't seen yet is that with the addition of those 2 perks will come their weapons. Weapons that any player of any perk can buy. I expect to see medics commonly buying crossbows, or any class, really, buying a pipe bomb or 2 throughout the games. People use off-perk weapons all the time in Killing Floor 1, and some of the most effective straight killing strategies involved it. That's why I think it's a good idea to wait for more perks to be added before making a certain judgment on the balance of Scrakes. And that's not even mentioning Berserker's badass grenades. Regarding the tankiness of Scrakes in the current stage of the game, I don't really know what to say, to be honest. They take a huge amount of damage, yet players are managing to beat Hell on Earth as it is, without Sharpshooter, without Demo, and sometimes even without support. However, I've noticed a particular strategy that players often use against Scrakes.
Oh man, there he is, Kiari Mundi, fucking big head asshole. What a fucking useless piece of shit.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, he's not very cool. I mean, a lot of the Jedi aren't very cool.
Everyone's after that blue tentacle-haired girl.
I haven't actually, but I should.
Aaliyah Sakura, that's her name.
This Scrake circling strategy is something a lot of players are concerned about. Most seem to think this is unintended, and while it doesn't look like a bug to me, it certainly is easier to take care of a Scrake this way than I bet Tripwire intended. Generally, when players voice their opinions that Scrakes are too tanky, they're assuming that this strategy will be removed in future updates. I see this as a dilemma. The strategy addresses people's concerns that Scrakes should be able to be dealt with by any perk, but on the other hand, it's just way too easy. Sure, in the middle of a real game, it's a bit different. You have to worry about lesser Zeds closing in on you, among other things, but since Scrakes are often left until the end of the wave anyway, I still think this strategy makes Scrakes too easy to deal with. Rather than having the ability to circle Scrakes removed completely, I think simply nerfing it would be a good idea. Make it so that the player can circle a Scrake for 2 or 3 seconds, after which the Scrake will get pissed off and do some kind of spin attack. That would make the strategy still viable, but it would demand the player dealt damage very quickly and efficiently, making as many of their shots as possible hit the head and punishing those who don't get enough damage in with a hard hit. Whatever Tripwire decides to do about Scrake circling, if anything, I hope what they don't do is remove the ability to dodge Scrake's initial swings when first approaching them. I've seen several players say they don't want that removed, and I haven't seen anyone disagree, and I certainly don't. That's about it, I guess. Like I said, I wanted to focus on the negatives in this video, but I do really like the game a lot, so I'll end the video with a few positive things I haven't seen anyone else mention. The Scrake never skips back day. You can do your shaking blood off animation by attacking teammates. Stalkers have breast physics and are very good dancers. Sirens are simultaneously the most terrifying and most endearing enemy in any video game. The 4 new bands whose music is featured in Killing Floor 2 are all Christian metal bands. Impending Doom, Becoming the Archetype, Living Sacrifice, and Demon Hunter. Isn't that weird? I wonder why Tripwire did this. I mean, it can't be a coincidence. I mean, it's fine. They're all really good. The music in this game is great. You can make Anna's head look like a pumpkin, and that's pretty cute. Okay, bye.